Welcome to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. Join us as we share our favorite RPGs, one-shot games, tabletop games, reviews, and convention panels. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hi, this is Kelly, aka Trixie from Ragnarok and Roll, assigned to Ragnarok Story, and Tilda Wimblewick from D&D Journey of the 5th Edition. First off, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening to our varied adventures, as well as for rating us on iTunes and RPGpodcast.com. If you haven't rated us yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could. And if you're looking for more ways to support our efforts, we are now on Patreon, a great site where you can help us continue making more podcasts, as well as some special surprises for our patrons. If you can, please look us up at www.patreon.com/cppn. Every little bit helps. And again, thank you for listening.
All right, so our next guest today is an award-winning comic book creator known for his extensive work with Marvel and DC, including the titles The Avengers, Justice League, and of course, The Flash. Please welcome the amazing Scott Kolins. Thank you for coming. I know you're on tight time, and I appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Of course.
I guess my first question for you today is I learned that you went first to a traditional college, and then before decided to switch to the famous Joe Kubert School.
Right.
Can everybody hear me? I'm sorry, I was a little away from my mic. Switch to the Joe Kubert School. What prompted the change?
It was really just the academic curriculum that they would have involved in the regular college that I went to, which was by my hometown. But it was a full college, so they had a whole art program, Bachelor of Arts, which a couple friends of mine did go through. Pardon me. But I even showed the instructors that I had at that time what I wanted to do. I showed them comic book stuff. I showed them the pages I was already working on. I had already formed or been part of a comic book club, where in my hometown I was lucky enough to find that there was a comic book artist working in my hometown. And a bunch of us kids would bother him, so we made a little club out of it, so it was only one day a week that we would bother him so he could get his deadlines done. But through all of that, I figured out what the page looked like, what the size of it was, all those different things. So when I got to college, when I graduated high school, I showed the instructors at college, at the regular Bachelor of Arts kind of college, and they just were bewildered. They didn't know what to do. This was a while ago. I think a lot of colleges now have curriculums that include comics or storyboards or anything similar to that. But this was a while ago. And yeah, they had nothing. He just shook his head. He had no idea how to help me or what to do about it. So another friend of mine at the same time had the same frustration, and we both looked through a couple different choices. And one of them was the Kubert School, and we decided, okay, let's give it a shot and see how it goes. We actually didn't know that much about it. I learned much more about the school after I was there and all the alumni that they had and all that kind of stuff. But thankfully, the Kubert School did turn out to be the perfect place. Especially for the time that I broke in, they really stressed the idea of not only being as exact and correct as you could be with knowing your figure anatomy and your perspective and all these different things and storytelling and different stuff. They also were very adamant about the deadlines of your assignments in class and stuff like that, and a lot of those did build up, so you were effectively drawing some 40, 60 hours during the week to get those assignments done. It was a lot, and more than anything else, like 50% of the points of any assignment would have been just handing it in on time. Because when I broke into comics at that time, that was still that was a huge cardinal sin to be late. That was not acceptable at that time, because it would have costed the company, when they were printing their comic books, it would have cost them $20,000 or $40,000 to be running late. Because those printers run, and if you don't get your comic book there on time, they charge you for the time anyway. So then the Kubert School worked out perfect. I did it for 2 years out of the theater program, and then I was lucky enough that several other classmates of mine got hired at that new company that was forming at the time, Valiant Comics. And through them getting hired for all sorts of jobs, because that was one of the benefits of the Kubert School, was that we learned how to letter, we learned how to color, we learned how to paste up, do all sorts of different stuff from back in those days before computers were going on. So a bunch of my friends were hired as colorists and inkers and letterers and different things. And I had been pushing my portfolio mostly as a penciler, but I was able to do other stuff. And there were times initially that my first jobs would have been those other assignments, inkers and colorists and different things. But I was hired to be a penciler. It was only for a short time. I didn't fit in very well with the company regimen or the ethos. But it worked out great that, again, after that, then I started working at Marvel and at DC, and I've pretty much been a freelancer ever since.
Yeah, going back to that original school, were they dismissive of your work, or did they appreciate it and just didn't know how to help you?
They weren't dismissive of my work or my drawing ability or whatever at the time. I was at least average as far as a beginning student would go. Even in high school, because maybe I'd had comic book club or this or that. In high school, when we had our art classes, and I was certainly no great shakes, but other kids would walk up to me with their life drawing figures and whatnot and ask for pointers of what I was doing, that kind of thing. Because our teacher was just a really general high school arts teacher, so he had no specifics, knowledge of anatomy or drawing people or anything like that. He was better at drawing bowls of fruit and drapery or those kind of things they would do. Did I answer the question?
Yeah. I just was wondering if, because you said the original college when you went there.
Oh, right.
It just didn't work out, and I was wondering if they were, because they didn't know what to do with you, I wondered if they were dismissive of your comic book work, or they just simply didn't know how to help you with it.
I actually had the professor I had at the time was a new young guy that had just been at that college a couple of years. He was actually really cool. He was a nice guy. But he was just bewildered. He had no idea how to help me or anything else. Yeah, I think if I would have asked some of actually the previous professors that had more tenure or whatever all during that time, they probably would have been dismissive. They would, but at least he was young enough not to write it offhand.
So you said something about the Kubert School. You were there for how many years?
2 out of I believe it's still a 3-year course.
Program?
Yeah.
That seemed is that a common story that people don't finish the Kubert School because they get hired out or they start working?
The ones that you've seen out of their alumni, usually on that list, I think at least 50% of them or so don't wind up lasting or needing to do all 3 years before they start getting work. And I don't know if that means they had just a better background or lucky like I did because I had a comic book artist in my hometown or that kind of thing. But yeah, there's a bunch of them, I think, out of that list that didn't go all 3 years. And also I was in that same way. One of the great things about the Kubert School was that all of the instructors that are there, or at least I believe that's how it still is, but it was one of their bragging points, was that all of their professors there were working artists in whatever field that they were teaching. Some of the teachers I had while I was there were Kim DeMolder, who was inker at Marvel Comics at the time. And in fact, during my first year working with him or having him as a teacher, he and my other buddy that also came from my hometown, we both made it to the school. He hired us as backgrounders at one point because he needed the help getting that monthly grind done on the various projects he would get. Excuse me. And then the second year I was at the school, I had Bart Sears as a teacher. And it was about a year or so before Bart really blew up as the giant name that he came to be by 93 or whatever. And he was a great teacher. And he was also, again, one of those guys where beyond what we did in class, he also then set up extra time for us outside of class because a bunch of us, again, would just bother the heck out of him at all sorts of times. So he goes, well, let's meet after school and let's work on some more projects and do all sorts of stuff. Yeah, he is great. Really, really great. He also gave me my first interview up at DC Comic Books, which, as fate would have it, was with Archie Goodwin, who he had some connection with and doing stuff. And he actually told me at the time that I certainly wasn't ready for a project, he said, but he did want me to have the experience of the interview and talk about it, and he thought Archie would actually be the nicest guy to do that and not, crush me with telling me what I needed to learn. And Archie gave me some great advice during that interview.
Was that hard to hear, or was it something that
Oh, it was terribly hard to hear. One of my teachers says, "Look, I'll set you up in this thing so you can go on this interview. You're not ready, but you can have this next little step and see how it, how it's organized or how it goes, that kind of thing."
But his honesty was probably the best thing for you there.
Oh, yeah.
So eventually you were discovered at Marvel right after Valiant didn't work out, right? So you were
Right.
discovered at Marvel, and you worked there for a time, becoming one of the Ramita Raiders. Can you tell us what your experience was working at Marvel, and then what is a Ramita Raider?
A Ramita Raider was a program that was started by the mid-'80s, about a decade or so before me. It was, okay, so in working in-house at Marvel Comic Books, there would be a room about the size of this room that would be sectioned off occasionally, where it would be the bullpen, the famous bullpen that you'd always hear about in the Stanley soapbox and all that kind of stuff. Or at least the one as it was in the 80s, not the one he wrote about in the 60s. But beyond all the work that they did in the bullpen, and there were letters there and paste up and all sorts of people working, for some reason they needed a special group of hired on almost like assistants or interns, but we were paid. That they just need them to do our corrections. And we worked straight with John Romita himself. He had his office. We were down a separate corridor from the rest of the bullpen. John Romita had his office, who I interviewed with to get the job. Then next to him, he had an assistant art director, Steve Geiger at the time, and then there was a room for 3 or 4 of us, depending on who was working at that time. And we would just get whatever requests that came through from the editors came in, that somebody drew the wrong boot on Captain America or whatever it was at the time, which included also reformatting some artwork for different things because like pinup books and different things were getting popular at the time, the swimsuit specials and all those things. So we would occasionally reformat older pieces of artwork where there would have been a UPC box in the middle if it was a cover or something like that. We would fill it in to then make it printable in the new book. So we were doing art corrections for most of it. But it also at various times left us plenty of actual free time in there because it was, if there wasn't any job, if there wasn't a correction coming through, then we could kind of do what we wanted to do. So most of us were either working on our portfolios on our own jobs or little side jobs that we would pick up in the office. But more than not, what I would wind up doing is getting my next set of samples together, making photocopies, and then spending time just walking around the hallway, knocking on doors.
Oh wow! So was that intimidating at all, working with John Romita, or had you not realized that
No.
man he was? Or?
Meeting him was initially, daunting and all that kind of stuff. But he was such a nice guy. Absolutely disarming, average everyday guy, had no airs about him at all. He's very positive. He could be very strong and critical about certain things and what he needed to be done. But it was always very positive to all of us guys that were in the Raider office. And he always kind of felt like we were like some sort of like great-grandchildren of his and stuff too, which was really nice. I've seen the list later on that he kept a list of every one of the guys that was a Ramita Raider over the years, which I thought was really nice. He didn't have to keep a list of everybody that worked through. But a lot of famous names had gone through there. Kevin McGuire, I'm going to blank on all the other ones now, but he's the first one that comes to my mind. That he was just a few years, 5 years before me. He was just a great guy. And in fact, one of my first real freelance jobs for Marvel after that was a Spider-Man story. And I could draw Spider-Man okay, but I was having a devil of a time drawing Peter Parker. It just wasn't looking like Peter Parker. So actually, that's what I did was in the middle of that job, I took my pages up to John and I said, please help. And he was always super gracious about any of that stuff. He said, oh, sure, come on down. What's problem? What is it that's catching you? He'd talk us through it, the whole thing. And then, he'd put tracing paper over my drawing, which is what I was really looking for, and have him fix everything when he'd just draw it all. So I found a couple tracing papers over the years that I did keep from stuff that he'd sketched on.
Oh, that's awesome. The idea that you're getting like advice on how to draw Peter Parker.
I know.
That's crazy. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So eventually you ended up in DC. And you became best known for your work probably on The Flash, would you say? What was it like working with Jeff Johns on The Flash, and what was that experience like?
That was another real special, magical time. I had started working with Jeff before we were on The Flash. He had that other book, Stars and Stripe, where he had the Star Spangled Kid or the female version, all that stuff. We were both working at various stages with Mike Carlin, the editor at that point. I had finished up some previous jobs and some runs on stuff. Like I had almost done about a year's worth of Legion of Superheroes before that. But even though the book was getting changed and overhauled and everything else, DC was very happy with my work at the time. So they kept feeding me little jobs here and there to make sure that I stayed comfortable at DC and didn't wander back to Marvel or something else. They were really good and loyal about that back then. And at some point in those extra jobs, that's where I got a couple fill-ins on Stars and Stripe with Jeff. And then I saw him at a San Diego con after that, like our first or second issue that I had done. I was only supposed to do one fill-in issue, and then because it went so well and the regular guy was so late, I wound up doing 3 issues in a row. But by the end of those 3 issues, Jeff and I were like bonding big time. I'm from the Midwest, he's from the Midwest. We both had a lot of same attitudes and values about getting the work done and all those things. So then by the time we were done with that, he and I were starting to formulate proposals for Hawkman, Captain Marvel, all sorts of stuff at DC. I don't know if any of those actually would have happened or not. We didn't quite finish those proposals by the time. Okay, the timeline of getting on Flash is weird. Jeff and I had those proposals while we were actually still formulating them and figuring out how we were going to do them. I got a phone call from the Flash editor saying, about 6 months earlier, saying, "Hey, would you like to do an issue of The Flash?" I said, "Sure, why not? That's great." And again, I was getting all sorts of little jobs here and there from DC. I was doing a Wonder Woman job here, or all sorts of different things. Green Lantern job. So sure, I'll do this issue of Flash. What I didn't know was that this was basically a test issue for me to see if I could be their next Flash guy. They liked the issue, everything was great. I drew it in my more standard style of time, which included shadows and other things with it. But I'll admit that once I was drawing it, sometimes when you're drawing characters in books, or a lot of times, I find that it could take me 3 to 6 months working on that book to really get the feel of the character and what the book needs to do and everything. With that one fill-in issue, the honeymoon issue of Wally and Linda, it just came out like butter. Or at least the Flash stuff, part of it did. The running poses and all those things came out very fluid, very natural, and I don't think they were done exactly how they'd been done before. I was trying. Anyway, that went well enough so that I was hired for the regular book. But the complicated story is that when I was given the job of the monthly Flash book, Scott McCloud was the writer listed for the job. That only lasted about a month or something in there, where I was told I was going to get a script soon, and then Scott dropped out. Then, I can't remember if there were 2 more people, 3. I remember that Jerry Ordway was also on the list, that at one point the Flash editor called me and said, "Hey, I've now got Jerry Ordway writing the book. Is that cool with you?" And I said, "Sure, of course, that's fine." I got no problem with that at all. But again, I didn't even get to talk to Scott. I didn't get to talk to Jerry before only a week or 2 or whatever later. Then Jerry had dropped out of it too. And by that point, the Flash editor was like, "Okay, I've run through my Rolodex of the top guys I was thinking of to work on this book." I had known this editor for years. I'd known him actually at my start at Marvel Comic Books. He was an editor at Marvel Comic Books too for a while. Anyway, we kind of knew each other, so it was a little more comfortable. And he said, "I'm not sure who to ask next. Do you have a suggestion?" And I said, "Well, there's this guy I was working with on Stars and Stripe." And I said, "He's a huge Flash fan, and I think he's really good." And I did. I really did like the Stars and Stripe stuff. And I really liked his dedication and how hard he worked and all these things. And his communication level. He was really in tight with his whole team. He likes to talk to everybody on the team. So I suggested to Joey. Joey said, "Okay, we'll give him a shot." And then it was a weird thing. So whether you guys saw the comic books was that Jeff wrote 6 issues of an arc before I got on the book, which was all like backwards and everything. So I wound up waiting for months, waiting to see if Jeff was going to get hired on full as the regular writer. And I had other jobs that DC was having me do at the time. But by his 2nd or 3rd issue, I think, of that arc, they decided, he was good for the job. Yeah. And then it was just magic after that. As soon as he knew he had the job officially, at that point, we were both on the West Coast. He was down in LA. I was up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And again, something that Jeff does that no one else has ever done. In my entire career, no, it doesn't matter who I've worked with, anything else. He flew up from LA, and we spent a weekend just talking about the book. And he had a map that he wanted to make, a keystone that he was working on stuff. He was already doing some little bit of sketches of some of the characters and what he wanted to do with them. Like I said, he's a huge Flash fan. That is his favorite book. And then he started telling me about the rogues and everything else too. So that was just a complete invigorating weekend. Plus, like I said, I've never done that with any other writer that I worked with. I've had to chat over the phone or this or that, occasional emails or whatever. But for him to take that time and then come up and see me where I was and hang out and do all that stuff. And then while we were working on the book, we talked every day. At least once a day we chat about stuff, about whatever was going on with the book or whatever we thought the book was going, or also the multitude of readings going on. And he's just a great guy to work with, not only just being super talented, but just being that kind of a friendly guy and always looking for, looking for my opinion on stuff or whatever. And sometimes it was little things, sometimes it was big things. I suggested to him that we should make a new trickster that was a kid, an evil Robin. So that's where Axel came from as that young kid version of trickster. Jeff was the one who wanted us to give a new costume or update the costume for Weather Wizard. So that went through all those things, but that's because Jeff wanted that. We just talked about everything about the book. I knew early on that Hunter Zolomon was going to be turning into Zoom and doing all that stuff, and I thought that was great, how he was organizing it. That again, that's one of my favorite pieces of those adventure kind of comic books, is that you get that long haul of a story that could last a year or even 3 years or whatever on it. And so we were on there about 3 years, and at the beginning of our time, about 6 months in, somewhere in there, we introduced the Hunter Zolomon character to be another police force character that Wally was working with. And then 2.5 to 3 years later, we then turn him into one of his ultimate villains. And I think that's a great payoff for the readers of the book. I always loved that stuff when they did that in Titans or X-Men or anything else. That is definitely part of the magic that might be missing somewhat today, but it's magic that you can hardly get in any other media. I mean, you'd have to have a long-running TV show like a MASH or something like that, or whatever from back in the day, that would call back to something they did from season 1, season 2, and then bring it back and give you this huge payoff and stuff. I thought that was all great. The other thing to remark about Jeff is that he's a little more equipped and business-minded than I am when we work on this stuff. I can occasionally, not too often, throw tantrums and be upset about certain needs and decisions that the company wants to make about stuff. Jeff is not built that way at all. He is a consummate professional. Still trying to do the absolute best that it is for the book. But the example I'll give you is that when we did Rogue's Revenge, after we hadn't done Flash stuff for a while, I came back to DC after being in Marvel again for a number of years. We started with the Rogue's Revenge book, but the Rogue's Revenge book was supposed to be the Flash and the Rogue's Revenge, or Flash and the Rogues, or whatever it was. So Wally was supposed to be in that book throughout the whole 3 issues. After he'd written the first issue, or at least half of the first issue, I know I'd seen some pages, and Jeff and I were talking about them, how it was working out. Jeff called me one afternoon and said, "Hey, I hate to tell you this, but Rogues is dead." And I was crushed. I'm like, "What are you talking about? What do you mean it's dead? This was the book, when I came back to DC, that was one of the big things that Jeff was telling me, come back and we'll do this book." So I got really upset about it. It didn't take more than an hour that Jeff got off the phone with me, thought about it for a minute, called DC back, and yeah, he's got their ear and they're comfortable with him and everything else. But that doesn't mean they're not going to say no on other projects. They told us no after Flash was done, the original one we did. He and I, again, had a bunch of different proposals shooting out there for the Atom, for Hawkman or Captain Marvel or whatever else. And they said no to us. But at this point, for Rogue's Revenge, after they had said no to the project, I think mostly because they didn't want Wally West in the separate book, because this was also leading into the return of Barry Allen. They didn't want Wally West to have that kind of a strong presence as a Flash character for it. I think that's what it was. But anyway, within about an hour, Jeff called me back and said, "I've got it re-greenlit. It's only the Rogues, no Wally." And I went, "Okay, how are we gonna?" And then we talked about it for a little bit, and then we both, by the end of that conversation, were like, "This is even better. This is a better story." That wouldn't have happened if it was just left up to me. I would have been, screaming and crying and throwing a tantrum and everything else, and then figuring out, what else I was going to do. Jeff was the one who saw that through line going like, "Oh, okay, this is their complaint. How can I work within this complaint? Fix this. You're given just these box of tools of, whatever to sandbox to play in. How can I rearrange this and then get this to the company and still have us do a neat comic book?" He's a master at that.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Well, I have other questions for you, but I want to give folks in the audience a chance to ask any questions if they have them. Anybody out there have any questions? Yes, sir.
What's one of your favorite projects that you worked on, personally?
Well, actually, Flash would be definitely one of them. They're all personal on some level or another. There's been very few projects that I've ever done that didn't, I didn't feel like I learned from, or that by the time, even if not at the beginning, by the time I finished it, that I felt really honored to work with it. I loved working with Keith Giffen and all the other guys that I've worked with. Beyond that, for the mainstream, I will say the most personally rewarding jobs that I've had were either ones that I got to write and draw for the big companies like Solomon Grundy or Citizen Cold, stuff like that, or the creator-owned stuff that I'm doing. Like I did Adam Point 3, that miniseries, Castaways with Matt Kint, and my new book, Patra. That if you guys want stickers, I brought stickers for the end of this thing. It's just that level of involvement with those projects. Again, Patra, I have James Robinson on as a writer, but just like I was with Jeff on The Flash or the other books that I really did enjoy, we were working with Keith Giffen on Blue Beetle or Larfleeze or any of those things. I'm one of those guys. I was raised on the Jack Kirby's, the John Burns, the George Brett, the Frank Millers, all those guys. So the artist, if not was also the writer, he was usually then a co-plotter or something involved with the whole context of whatever the book was about. So that's what really drives me on more of the projects that mean something to me. Because I just love being embedded into the whole thing. And I like coming up with ideas. I like playing them out. I also like working in a team and stuff like that. And James had some really interesting insights and ideas for what to do with Patra that I would have never thought of. But yeah, it's just being, soup to nuts, head to toe, whatever, involved with the project as much as I can. That's where, beyond even just the writing end of it, on Adam, I didn't do it as much on Castaways, but and now on Patra, all the artwork that's in there, the penciling, inking, and coloring, that's all me on all that stuff. And I don't think I could ever express to you to the mountain of work that becomes. Even me, who's a seasoned pro, who's done this for a bunch of decades now, when I worked on Adam and I was doing it all by myself as writer, penciler, inker, and colorist, but I also worked with the letter and the whole thing. And then even here I'm doing Patra. There were times beyond all the years of experience, and I made many, many books. Holy cow, when you're doing the whole thing by yourself, it is really just a whole nother mountain to deal with. And there are many, I don't know what you want to call it, staging points along there where you want to quit. It's so much work. It's so much that you have to put into this thing, and so many hours and everything else. It challenges you constantly, especially when you're doing that whole pie. But in that same way, it's also kind of the most rewarding.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book since you have us here?
Yeah. So Patra is about a young girl who wakes up in a dangerous situation. She's out of town, on the edge of town in the woods, and there's a serial killer that's after her. Meanwhile, the other half of the story that gets started is that the serial killer that's after her was also doing his business in this small town. And then all of that's going to converge and whatnot as it goes along. That's the normal, as the advertising on the book would say, the slasher movie kind of part of the story that's going on. But at the same time, every time Patra's in danger, or she finds herself in those spots in the woods, she gets this skull mask, and she gets a knife in her hand, a giant knife as far as she's concerned. And she doesn't know where it's coming from. So there is other stuff that's going on. I kind of link it to a little bit of X-Files, or also a little bit of, what was his name? The 70s TV show with the news reporter who was chasing down the...
Cripple Hulk?
Kolchak?
No. What's
Kolchak?
that? Yes.
Kolchak.
Yeah. That was it. So there are kind of extra, not terrestrial, but yeah, a little bit of supernatural elements, involved in the storyline. And again, it was we had a ton of fun with it because my mix in the beginning was that I had the girl character and the look, and I had one aspect, or the main aspect for her character of what she was going to deal with, and then it was going to end by the end of this 4-issue story. When I brought the idea to James and we wanted to work together on something, I told him, well, I have this thing and I just haven't done it yet. What do you think about this one? So my beginning of it, you could say, was kind of a alternate, twisted version of the old Carpenter 1978 Halloween movie. I really love that opening sequence where there was that kid holding the butcher knife and wearing the clown costume. That was just so mind-blowing. I have other twists on there based upon that, but then when James came in on the project, he had what he called his Silence of the Lambs ideas and twists and turns that came from that kind of priority. So then we talked about it very quickly and we go, oh, well, this is going to mix really well, so that not only does it make this Patra first issue arc more interesting and more complicated and cool, it's also allowing us the possibilities for more series after this, where initially my story would have just ended by the end of the 4 issues. And we're in talks with Dark Horse right now about doing the continuing one. So the sales pitch that they give you about there and the previews catalog and stuff like that is saying that this book is a love letter to the old slasher movies from the 80s or 90s, that kind of stuff. And it is, on some levels. We do hold back on most of the gore. It's more, that's why I like the Halloween movie, because most of that was about the tension and the scariness and the build-up, and there really wasn't that much blood.
And yeah, you don't notice. Like, you don't think about it not being a gory movie.
Right.
Other than the scene where he posts the guy up.
Yeah, he sticks him to the wall. It's a love letter to the slasher films, and in that way of thinking about it, I will admit that then you could think of the long haul of what we'll do with Patra if we get allowed to. Is that you could say this first story arc is kind of Halloween-centric, sort of. But the next one is like, we could do a Friday the 13th kind of centric story. We could do a Texas Chainsaw Massacre story, all that stuff. And James has already, in one of the issues, you'll hear somebody talk about some of that stuff that's going on in there, and showing the opening for all the other stories. And hopefully we'll get a chance to tell them, because they're pretty fun. I really liked how this first one went and how it wrapped up and everything. And then there's some neat twists and turns at the very end of the story, even onto the last page, that no one should see coming.
Very cool. I love the idea that she's in danger and this butcher knife just appears in your hand. It's awesome. Butcher knife, that's awesome. I think we have time for one more question if anybody has one. If not, I got maybe one more.
I have one. Going back to your process, how long does it take you to do an average page? Do you work on like 1, 2, maybe 3 pages a day?
When I'm starting a project, depending upon the week, my Mondays are split between looking at the script of whatever has come in that I'm working on or working on my own, but then doing thumbnail breakdowns for like the first 5 pages or so. If I'm working with a writer that's newer to the business or something, like one of the writers I'm working with right now on a side project, he's more of a TV writer. Excuse me. He doesn't quite know the ins and outs of how to start a page, end a page, or those kind of things. So I'll need to break down more pages along there, maybe 10 pages or more, to make sure that they're all working, that the scenes fit and flow and all that kind of stuff. But normally, for most comic book writers that have already the experience of how to handle that stuff, I'll only need to do about 5 pages of breakdowns, just enough to get me through the week's work. And then I'll spend the rest of that week working on those 5 pages. Most of the time, it's a page a day. Sometimes if it's a new project, it can slow down a little bit if I need to get a handle on that Peter Parker that's giving me a problem or whatever. Or there are the other pages, like one I was on Flash, that we did a Gorilla Grodd issue early on, which I really pushed for. And then Jeff understood and liked it. The end of the Grodd story that we did was this huge pullback shot of Keystone, and we were supposed to show that Grodd had gone through, several different blocks worth of the city and done all this destruction. Again, we spent most of that issue, like most of the other issues we did on The Flash, whatever villain we had in there, we were trying to make the villain seem really cool and impressive, so that they actually seemed like they were a worthy foe or adversary for the Flash. So we pulled back at the end of that Grodd issue, and we just I showed not only the tons of the destruction, but it was a top-down shot of the city at that point. Kind of crazy shot. And it was just took extra time because I'm drawing tons of buildings, tons of rooftops of all these buildings, everything else. So you could see Grodd at the main intersection of the street, but you would see all this damage that he had done for blocks and blocks and blocks. I finished that. It only took me like an extra day or so, I think, in getting it done. But when I finished it and I handed it in, Jeff goes, you shouldn't have done that. And I said, what do you mean? What did I do wrong? He goes, no, I know you can do this stuff. And in that same line of thinking, he did have me do other city shots then. We had city shots where they were, where it was a central city and Keystone. So I was doing these giant, monstrous Akira shots of the two cities. And in that same frame of reference, I will tell you one of my neatest little con experiences that I had when I was going to the cons as an early professional. I was in Baltimore, where I'm going to be in a month. And I had just about finished my Flash run, I think, at that time. But I was busy doing this and that and whatever, and I was talking to Jeff. He was there at the con, and we're doing this and that, whatever. Next thing I know, George Perez is in front of my table. I'm quavering because when I was still breaking in, a friend and I had done a terrible 4 or 6 page comic book that we'd gone up to George and shown him our book and said, please tell us, that we're geniuses.
Yeah.
George is an absolutely angel of a person. He was sweet, nice, super positive, everything else. But he will cut you to the bone when you're showing him crap. And our book was crap. But we left that meeting with George at that time split. We were crushed, and we wanted to just burn our 6 pages that we just had right now. They were absolutely used. There was nothing to save about any of them. But we were also flying on a cloud because we had just heard all this great advice from George Perez. And he left us with the enthusiasm to do this, that we wanted to do this. We wanted to get better at all of this. Cut to the Baltimore that I was at Flash Time. George walked up, looked at a couple of my pages, said he had heard about me, looked through a couple more, and he pointed to one of the pages I did that was, again, one of these crazy double-page spreads of just tons of detail and tons of backgrounds and everything else going on. And he goes, once you do this, they're going to keep asking. I went, yeah, I know. But that was a super neat moment for me to bond with George on that same thing, because he was obviously in that same boat.
Yeah.
He'd gone over into the crazy detail stuff, the armies of people that he would draw, and then he would constantly ask to draw armies of people. Yeah.
So, what the takeaway from this conversation is, don't put your best foot forward. I want to thank Mr. Kolins for joining us today. I know you got to jump on a plane directly after this almost.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys for hanging out. We appreciate you all week, and thank you for coming to Tucson Comic Con. I know you guys appreciate you coming out.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That sounds like a really cool con. Check it out.
Thank you. Oh yeah, and the first issue of Patra came out last week.
Oh.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Play-In Podcast Network. If you enjoyed our show, please check out D&D Journey of the 5th Edition and Ragnarok Enroll a Scion Hero to Ragnarok Story. Also, check out our Patreon page for more content and behind-the-scenes things, as well as joining us for a one-shot game or two.